welcome to How to Be a Responsible Open Source Citizen. This is a very non-technical talk, so it will just be about open source in general. My name is Ivar Grimstad. I'm the Jakarta developer advocate at Eclipse Foundation. And in this setting, I'm more Eclipse Foundation than Jakarta, but I'm still Jakarta, you know. So these are my social media coordinates if you want to connect with me during, after the talk for some reason. I'll try to respond as good as I can. What I will talk about today is just do some open source general things and talk about consuming responsibly, contributing responsibly, and then sum up at the end. And I'll mix them a little bit, but I'll try to keep sort of this order of things. As I said, I'm from the Eclipse Foundation, and many of you probably know the Eclipse IDE. And the Eclipse IDE is actually one project. And this is an old slide. I think it's 430 or something. So we have more than 400 projects, and the IDE is one of them. And that's also why we changed the logo from the IDE logo. It's different to the foundation logo. So we're an open source foundation. We have lots of projects, and the IDE is one of them. And another one is Jakarta, which is a project I'm working on. And some of you may have been in my talk before this one, so I won't go into details about this one. But Jakarta is 5 years old this year. So we're celebrating a 5-year anniversary of Jakarta, so at Eclipse Foundation. That's one of the projects. Jakarta 10 is the version that is available now. It has a lot of updated specifications. All the blue ones were updated in 10. And we're working on Jakarta 11, which will be released next year. So 6 years after, we're now on Jakarta 11. The platform is divided into a smaller subset, which is the web profile, and an even smaller subset, which is the core profile. Another interesting project at Eclipse Foundation is Adoptium, which is also Java related. How many of you have heard of Adoptium? Yeah, good. So then you know about the Adoptium marketplace, where you can download secure Java OpenJDK distributions. So all these vendors have distributions there. Eclipse Foundation has one as well. It's called Eclipse Tamarin. And Tamarin is kind of a cool name. You know, it's a anagram of runtime. So that's kind of funny. But that's one of the runtimes you can get there. You can get all the other vendors, their runtimes here. What differentiates Adoptium from other places where you can download the open JDK distributions is that we have the Aquavit testing suite, which is testing the TCK test for compatibility, but the Aquavit test for quality. So you get runtimes that are also tested for some of the production requirements you would have to. So these are good runtimes you get from here. So let's talk about open source in general. And how many of you are consuming some form of open source, like a dependency or a tool or something? Yeah. And how many of you are contributing to open source? Yeah, a little fewer. So this is how it usually is, that we consume a lot more than we contribute. And the purpose of this talk is hopefully to inspire you to shift this a little bit so we contribute more. And in open source, we have these open source principles of how to do things. And I'll go through each of them. There are 5 principles of open source. And these are common among all open source projects. It's not only Eclipse Foundation. It's Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation. All the other foundations have the open source rules of engagement. And that is transparency. Everything is in the open. You have all access to information and materials. So nothing hidden or backroom things going on. Everything is open. It's transparent community. It's also a collaborative effort. So by enhancing each other's strengths, we get stronger together. So it's not a single man show. It's always a collaborative effort. And by collaborating together, you can enhance each other in a way that you didn't even know you could. So that's the second principle of open source. The third one is release early and often. So it's free to experiment. You learn by doing, right? You would rather discover rapidly if you have to change something than late in the game. So frequent releases is also an open source principle. And it's very inclusive. And it's based on meritocracy. So the more you contribute, the more you have to say. So if you come in as a newbie in an open source project, you would probably be kind of picked on by some of the old people. But it's always the best ideas should win. So when you have good ideas, you're merited for it, and you may even get committer status. You don't have to be a committer to contribute to open source. But down the path, if you contribute a lot, you may gain committer status, and then you're kind of growing in the meritocracy. But it's always based on what you do. You cannot pay and get in. And it's a community. So it's uniting about some core values, some shared purpose, and it's always the community over the individual goals. So you may come into an open source project and have some specific features that you are very passionate about and want this library or tool to go. But if the community wants something different, then it's always the community over the individual goals. So these are the kind of the 5 pillars of open source. Another thing that comes along when we talk about open source is open source licenses. And I mean, we're developers, right? So and license, do we care? I mean, do we know even? There is some open source initiative out there, opensource.org. Where you can see all the open source licenses, and it's very strict what actually is an open source license. So they have all the information here, and it's where you can find all the information about the open source license, and it actually pays attention to read the license text once in a while, so we know which license you should consume or what you should use. But the most important distinction is that not everything that it has the source out there is open source. It's not about showing the source, because open source is very different from source available. So source available, you can see the code, but there may be restrictions on the use. So if you see something code on Stack Overflow, it can still be restricted by some license, and you're not necessarily allowed to use it. But open source is about it's freely accessed, it's freely used, you can change it, and you can share it in any modified or unmodified form by anyone. So that's a very different thing between open source and source available. So about consuming open source then. We're all consumers of open source. So let's look at some different types of open source projects and how they kind of relate together. So there are other types, but I've listed 4 of them here. You have the solo developer, the single vendor, and the community, and the foundation kind of open source. So let's look at each of these in detail. So the solo developers, it's typically 1 or 2 programmers publishing something on GitHub. And they have full control over whatever's going on. They're very passionate about it, very protective. They can be very open to allow people to come in to contribute, or they can be very rejective because they want to protect their thing, their baby. And usually it's just something that's put out there. You can use it, but if you want some changes or need some changes, it can even be abandoned, not used anymore. And I've listed a couple of examples here. ByteBuddy is very active. That's a small group of, or a small community around it. Snoopy is actually my open source project. It's fairly abandoned. But so that's an example of what can happen with an open source project. So, there are also risks with this solo open source project. And anyone recognize these logos? So JavaScript developers would see that this is logos for Faker.js and Colors.js, which were some very popular, or probably is very popular, frameworks or libraries for JavaScript. And here there were some disputes, and the developer, the solo developer, introduced some mischievous commits into those, so it kind of broke everything that used this, and they're very widely used. So this can happen with like solo open source project. It can go wild. You know. So with a single vendor, that is open source that is usually backed by a company, and the employees of that company are the contributors. It can to contribute to these that are controlled by companies can be hard if you're not working for that company. So the only way of actually being a part of that open source community is to join that employer. But what you get for it is they also usually have a commercial offering behind it, so they have very responsive changes. It's very active projects. You can get very good support from it. So they're usually very good stuff to use. But there can be some pitfalls there and here and there. Quarkus is one example. Spring Framework, Gradle. These are all kind of one company things, but they can always do whatever they want with the project. And I don't know if anybody is using Scala here. So Akka did this. The Lightman did with Akka, changed the license from Apache 2 to Business Source License 101. And that is perfectly fine. They can do that. It's their business. But what does that mean for us as consumers if you're using Akka? If you used it under Apache 2, well, it's open source. If it's Business Source License 101, it's source available. You cannot use it unless you pay the license. And they will contribute it back to Apache every second year. That means if you're using the open source version, you would have to wait 2 years to get the security updates. So this is how a single vendor that controls an open source project can do. And it's in their, it's in their interest, they're fully free to do so. So the community-based open source projects are kind of a more safer approach, but they can have lots of a big community around it. It can be welcoming. It can also be a very closed thing, but it's usually it's easier to get in there than a solo or a two-person project. Some examples are Postgre and OpenJDK. You can always, well, OpenJDK is sort of community, but it can be hard to get in there. But the community-driven ones are usually fairly active, and they usually don't go anywhere, and they won't do anything weird with the licenses because it's a community, and they serve the community over the individuals. But they can also kind of go away. How many of you worked on PowerMock here? Because this was founded here in Sweden. And PowerMock was a super testing tool for mocking Java objects. But it's and maybe it has lost its place, but it's not very active anymore. It's still there. You can use it. It's still good. But it could almost be considered a solo project. But there were a pretty decent community around it. But you see, communities can also be abandoned. So if we look at the foundation-driven one, and I've added Eclipse Foundation and Apache Foundation here because that's at least in the Java world, the biggest foundations. These are formal organizations that have projects, processes around it, governance, very structured. These are projects that companies contribute to as well, so it's usually business critical projects for them. They apply to all. They follow all the open source principles. There can be paid support from some companies on using their implementation of things. You can get communities around it that offers unpaid support. If you look at Apache Maven, for example, I think there are 10 developers sort of active on Apache Maven, and the entire world is using it. Millions of developers are using Apache Maven. It's 10 developers using creating it. Eclipse Jetty is backed by a company, but it's open source at Eclipse Foundation. Kubernetes, you probably know Kubernetes. It came from Google, but it's open source. It's at the CNCF. So these foundation-based open source projects are usually fairly safe because they're not going anywhere. But, I mean, things can happen here as well. And you probably remember this. And that brings us into security. And how many remember SolarWinds? Yeah. That wasn't my sound. SolarWinds was attacking your build chain. So there are threats to the code. It's more than threats in the code or bugs in the code. It's also the build chain is vulnerable to. And this has been focused very much on lately. And this is where the foundations come in. And this is a slide from Eclipse Foundation. It will look similar for the other foundations. But we have all these governance platform around things. And a open source collaboration platform where companies and individuals cooperate to create things, and then they compete on the products offered on it. And the Eclipse Foundation, we support these through the governance platform where we have infrastructure, we have all the ecosystem needed there, all the process development and the community support. Like we have a mailing list and tooling and the source repositories and everything and development process, elections for committers and all this kind of governance around it. We also have tooling for handling the intellectual property and licensing, creating SBOMs, for example, or check that your license is an open source. What we also are adding now is a support for supply chain security. So we also have this as one of our offerings. But and there are evolving expectations in the community and in the industry. It's around security. It's like, can I use this license? Can I do this with that? Do you have a bill of materials? Are you compliant with everything? How do you handle CVEs and stuff? So there are all these questions out there in the industry, and it's kind of responded to in different ways, and there are regulations coming around, and currently the software industry has been totally unregulated. Like we don't have regulations like if you're building a bridge or something, you have some rules and stuff to follow. In software, we don't really have that. But there is things coming. And in EU, we have the Cyber Resiliency Act coming. It's being voted on in Brussels. We don't really know what's going to happen there. But this is essentially introducing CE markings on software. So you know the CE mark you have on the electrical things. So it's kind of a quality assurance thing. And who is responsible for doing that? If you have a single person open source projects, you don't have the money to pay a lawyer to get that CE mark. If there's a requirement for a library to have a CE mark, that library will probably go away. So this can be crippling for the open source community and the industry as a whole. For example, if this is introduced for the European projects, will everybody move to the US and do open source there? Will European developers be able to contribute to US-based open source project? It's all questions. We don't know what the politicians do, but you can do something about it. You can reach out to your local parliament, your EU representative and send them an email and say, hey, please don't do anything stupid. There's another one that is even worse, also coming around. It's the Product Liability Directive. And this is a directive that's kind of flew under the radar of CRA, because CRA has gotten some attention out there, but the PLD is actually more dangerous, because this is about liability. Who is responsible? Who's going to be held accountable for something that doesn't work? If an open source project has a bug, like Log4j, who's going to pay for it? So I really recommend to read the blog post about PLD and CRI by Mike Milinkovic. He's the executive director of Eclipse Foundation. And he's there are from earlier this year, but he does follow a post on them. And he kind of describes what the dangers of this industry is. So if we have an opportunity to say our way, we should be careful about just embracing whatever the politicians come up with without knowing what we're doing. It's not only in the EU. In the US, they're doing the same thing. They have an executive order and the national cybersecurity strategy. They do it a little bit differently there, because they kind of say to the industry, hey, we haven't had imposed any regulations on you ever. Please regulate yourself, or we will do it. In the EU, the politicians are just saying, we will regulate you. And some of this, the text from this national cybersecurity strategy is actually fairly good. It says responsibility must be placed on the stakeholders most capable of taking action to prevent bad outcomes. But he also says that the not on the end users that often bear the consequences, nor on the open source developer of a component that is integrated into a commercial product. So it's the commercial entity that is responsible, not the open source developer. And that is what we want to have in the European regulations as well. So one thing that the Eclipse Foundation may be forced to do because of these regulations coming, and we probably are on the way of doing it, is to employ staff to work on public policies, as well as supply chain and other things. And Eclipse Foundation, to be honest, is probably better equipped than most open source foundations to do this, because we have staff. We're more than 60 people employed by Eclipse Foundation. And if you compare that to Apache Software Foundation, there are like 2 or 3. So we have the resources to be able to do this. Other open source foundations may not have it. So it is a kind of a dark sky over the open source community. I'm cautiously optimistic, but you never know what can happen. So and that brings us all into sort of contribute responsibly, because these regulations are behind us, around us there. But it's also about we do want to contribute. We don't want to be scared away from contributing. So we just need to do it in a safe and responsible way. And I don't know if this is a thing or anything, or I've just come up with it, but the first rule of contributing to open source, anyone had any ideas? Well, it is to do it. Right? So if you don't do anything, nothing will happen. So to go and ask an open source project for a feature without providing some help of getting that feature, who are you to say that there's these community people sitting in their basement coding on Saturday night are going to do your stuff? So all contributions matters. And questions you may have when I want to get started contributing to open source, maybe how do I get started? How do I convince my boss to allocate me some time to actually do this? And one thing, remember this one, that we're all consuming open source, and we're probably not consuming open source in our homes, in our free time. We're consuming open source for our employers, for our companies, for our products. So this is a slide you can show them and explain. We're consuming all this thing, but we're not giving back. And that is kind of the to kind of get the good spirit of people. But also you can say, we rely on this software. If this software goes away, we're screwed. And if we don't improve this software, our competitors will go ahead. So you can improve the software you rely on. So that's what you tell your boss. I can make this company better by improving the open source project that we are using in our technology that we're selling. So that's the why contributor. And then you can ask, well, can't you just fork it and do it internally? Of course you can. But it's also about the giving back part. And together we're better than alone. And it's about this collaborate on the open source platform and compete on the projects. So why, if you just think personally and for yourself, why should you contribute to open source? Well, one thing is improve your skills. You know, open source project, like the 10 Maven developers out there, they're pretty awesome. They're good coders. And by being the 11th one on that project, you will learn from these 10 and see the level they're on. So improve your skills by being part of these communities. It's much more worth the effort than going to a conference or going to a class or a course or something. This is where you see the real code out there. And also, build your reputation and career. Like, who reads CVs anymore? It's GitHub commit logs. If you're committed to a lot of open source projects, you don't need a CV. And another question you may have is, yeah, but I don't know where to start. Then you can think, or I'm not a coder. I'm not as good as these people. I can't. But it doesn't need to be code. It can be something else. It can be documentation. It can be graphics. You saw the cool logos for the JavaScript framework, the Faker.js and the other one. I would love those logos in our project. If somebody can say, hey, I've created this logo for you. Now we can AI generate stuff, but it's more, if you create a logo and contribute to it, you'll probably get it in. So rather than kind of forcing yourself to do something, it's to follow your passion. Just do whatever your head is in. Because if you're spending some time, and it's usually spending some free time as well, because let's face it, not all of us are in that position that we can spend 100% of our time on open source. We have some commitments to the company we're working for on the projects, and maybe you have a little time, but most of the time is probably on your own time. So you want to do something you're passionate about. And I'll just give a little example of how you can follow your passion, or how you can get into open source and navigate the different open source project. And I'll talk very quickly about my journey. So remember this? Know what it is? Yeah. So my first contribution to open source, I'm a Java developer, so I've been Java all the time. So what I did back in 2010 was Scala was coming around, and I saw they had this startup tutorial. It's a very short one in English and some other languages. So I translated it to Norwegian and contributed. So this was just a translation of a document. And I think it took 1 hour and it was on the webpage. So they're very appreciative to any non-coding contributions. So if you look at these different kind, Scala was a community back then. Now it's probably more single vendor thing. But that's where I contributed my first thing. Yeah. And after that, I joined the Java community process. I was a specification member on some of the specifications. I just saw they were starting up a new MVC specification, and I thought, yeah, I've done my fair share of MVC frameworks. I'll join them. I didn't contribute much, but I was on the mail list, and and voted and had a dialogue with them, and did a lot of talks on it. So I kind of built a name within the Java community process on that. And I was elected as a representative from the community into the executive committee. And I was there voting to delay Java 9. So if you look at the history of the voting there, you can see IBM and Payara and Red Hat and all these big companies voted no. And you can see my name there voting no. That's how you build it. You just kind of gradually go along. Yeah, the MVC project was one we took over when Oracle didn't want to do it anymore. We said, hey, let's do it as a community effort. So we did it outside of Oracle, but within the Java community process. It's now an Eclipse Foundation project. I also use NetBeans in my talks. So I had the NetBeans Dream Team, and I'm now a committer on Apache NetBeans. I started my own discovery service for Jakarta EE called Snoopy. It's still out there. It's not very active, as I said, but I'm there. Now Apache is at NetBeans. It's at the Apache Foundation, and I worked on Glassfish, and I work for Jakarta EE, and now I'm full-time Jakarta EE developer advocate at Eclipse Foundation. So that's kind of my journey. I've been in sort of all of these spaces, and now I'm working full-time open source. If that's what you want, and it's not necessarily going to be this journey, but this is how you can navigate within the different things. Why should you do it? Well, if you look at the foundations usually have these kind of awards. So we get a hoodie or T-shirt or something when you're every year they kind of list the top contributors. So how do I get contribute? It can be different from project to project. I'll show you how we do it in Jakarta EE. We have this page on the web page, get involved. So we have some videos. So there are some paperwork that needs to be signed, and also where to start the join the Slack channel, see the social media, the mail lists, the project lists, and etc. So usually all open source projects have some sort of getting started guide. And that's our version of it. You can also show your support for open source. I mean, even if you're not contributing to it, tweet about it, blog about it. The maintainers of open source always like it when somebody else talks about their thing. So if you say, I'm using Apache Maven and it's an awesome project, I'm guaranteeing you will get retweet and attention from the maintainers of Maven. And use the stickers. Show the support. Put them on. I have stickers there, so you can get some afterwards. Show the support for the open source project. Think when you do this also, just be aware of the things coming our way. So don't ignore this. But as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be good for us. But you never know what they do. So whenever there is an opportunity to sign some list or something, look at what Mike says on his blog and follow what the open source foundations do. And as I said, the open source foundations are probably better equipped to deal with all this kind of stuff and shield the developers. So these are the projects that are probably safer to contribute. This is a shameless plug for Eclipse Foundation. Apache will be the same. So any open source foundation is probably the safer way to be. So to sum up, we have these different types of open source projects. The solo, single vendor, community, foundation. All of them has their advantages. You can always start, if you have an idea, just throw some code on GitHub as a solo developer. Do that for a while, and then propose it as a project in a foundation. And that's even better after you've grown a community over it. So if you have a solo project, you morph it over to a community project and then go into a foundation. That could be a path to go. Or if you have a company and you have some library you're using internally that is not business like your core business, You can put it out there as a single vendor open source and maybe later move it to a foundation if it gets traction. So the first rule of open source, right? It's to contribute. So in either way, if it's a solo, community, vendor, or foundation, it's more important to contribute than not do it. If you want to know more about Eclipse Foundation, you can go to eclipse.org. Jakarta EE is on jakarta.ee. We have this Get Involved page on Jakarta EE. You can find the similar on other projects. If you want to read my blog, it's on agilejava.eu. And that's what I had to say. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you're inspired to contribute to open source. Any questions, comments? All right. I have, yes, one there. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is how is the responsibility for an organization to contribute back? Yeah. So I would say if you're going to be a decent player in the community and be seen as one, you should do it. I mean, you don't really have any responsibility to do it, but you can see it as an investment. Like, because if you're a big contributor to open source and you let your employees contribute to open source, you're probably considered a good employer, and you will attract the good people, and you can hire people that will sort of have some time on doing this open source thing, and it will build your reputation in the community. So it's kind of an incentive to be perceived as a better player in the community. Yeah. I have some stickers there, so just feel free to come back here and get them. So thank you very much.